Baby boys are going out of fashion. For most of history, parents have wanted sons, as they traditionally inherited the family's name and its wealth. But in recent years, this bias for boys has dramatically decreased in developing countries, and in the rich world, people are even starting to prefer daughters. If you leave it up to nature, there are roughly 105 male births for every 100 female ones. It's thought that this is an evolutionary response to higher male mortality. In the past, families tended to be bigger, so most parents ended up with a mix of sons and daughters. However, as families started to have fewer children, they could no longer assume they definitely have a boy. The spread of ultrasound in the 1980s gave parents a way to choose.
It looks like a girl.
The result? A massacre of female fetuses in some parts of the world. According to the Economist calculations, roughly 50 million fewer girls have been born globally since 1980 than you would expect. In 2000, the worst year, there were around 1.7 million more male births than would have been normal. Many of these missing girls are an unintended consequence of China's draconian one-child policy. When parents were only allowed one child and were desperate for a boy, they were more likely to abort girls. But since 2010, the number of missing girls has fallen dramatically. In developing countries such as Bangladesh and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there's now a desire for a mix of sons and daughters. And in the rich world, there's evidence of an emerging preference for girls. In South Korea, for example, the share of women who felt it necessary to have a son plunged from 48% in 1985 to 6% in 2003. Now, nearly half would prefer a daughter. In America and Scandinavia, couples are more likely to have multiple children if the early ones are male, suggesting that they're more likely to keep trying for a girl than a boy. Reasons for this bias vary. Girls are seen as easier to bring up. Traits seen as female are cherished. Many parents expect their daughters to look after them in old age. Meanwhile, the world has recently been exposed to a torrent of news about poor male behavior. Across society, more boys do badly at school, become violent, or end up in jail. In China, which has a skewed sex ratio, there's so many men that they often end up unmarried and childless. Parents might regard a son as more of a burden and more likely to be lonely than a daughter. But although the majority of parents aren't actively pursuing a daughter, some are, aided by advances in sex-selective technology. Currently, it's illegal in much of the world to pick the sex of your baby. But in some countries, parents and doctors quietly ignore the law, which is hard to police. In places such as Britain, parents can choose the sex of their child if it makes it less likely for the baby to inherit a serious illness. And in a few places, such as Mexico and America, the technology is both legal and widely available. Thousands of people travel to the United States from around the world to undergo procedures. So, what are these procedures? Sperm sorting, for example, works by adding a colored dye to a sperm sample. The dye binds to the genetic material differently for X and Y chromosomes. It's claimed to have 80 to 90% accuracy, though not all experts agree with this figure. Sex-selective IVF is another option. Doctors take cells from an embryo and determine its sex by counting the chromosomes. Some people who go through this process don't need IVF for any other reason, and it's often done alongside screening for genetic abnormalities. Success rates are reported to be high, with many clinics claiming 99% accuracy. For now, sex selection technologies, particularly IVF, are invasive and expensive. Parents at one New York clinic pay as much as $20,000 for sex-selective IVF. As a liberal newspaper, The Economist would prefer not to tell people what kind of family they should have. And if only a few people choose the sex of their children, it won't have any wider social consequences. But if lots of people do, there could be. In many developing countries in the past, a strong preference for baby boys led to a skewed sex ratio a generation later, with far more men than women. Those extra men were doomed never to find romantic partners. They strongly resented this. And their fury sometimes turned violent. Could the ratio skew towards girls in rich countries in the future? If so, it could have huge knock-on effects. Some people might speculate that a mostly female society would be more peaceful. No one can be sure. What is certain is that if women significantly outnumber men, then heterosexual women will find it much harder to find love or form a two-parent family. In the future, sex selection technologies are sure to get better and cheaper, which means people are more likely to use them, with consequences that may be as profound as they are hard to predict.